Welcome to War of the Words with me, your host, Wayne Besen. On today's show, we'll talk about what Republicans plan to do if the next coup succeeds. It's not a mystery. They are telling us, and it's terrifying. We will also discuss how the January 6th committee is proving that Donald Trump and his accomplices need to be in handcuffs to serve as a deterrent for those plotting the next coup. Finally, for Pride Month, we have a conversation with James Kirchick, author of Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the show. Have you ever wondered what life in America would be like had Trump's January 6th coup succeeded? Well, you don't have to wonder. One just has to look at the new Texas GOP platform to glimpse the future if the Republican treason train ends our beloved democracy. The Constitution will become the Bible, and our nation will devolve into a primitive state run by men, and I mean men, with medieval minds. Human rights, as currently understood, will cease to exist. LGBTQ people will retreat into the closet, deep into the closet, while women would return to the kitchen. Given today's shoe options, I doubt they'd be barefoot, but with Roe v. Wade on the cusp of being overturned, many will be victims of forced pregnancy. More than 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And they did this despite the fact the Orange Oath proved himself to be the most immoral presidential candidate in American history. So why did they vote for a vulgar sexual predator, thrice married congenital liar? Trump was embraced because he freed many white evangelicals to speak their minds and say what they truly believe. The core teachings of Jesus about love and peace were an annoying impediment to practicing their peculiar suburban strain of megachurch Christianity or rural right-wing fundamentalism. It was quite a burden, if you think about it, for these good Christians to have to pretend that they loved LGBTQ people or believed in racial equality or supported women's rights or cared about the poor and the homeless. Donald Trump replaced God and morphed into their golden idol who sat on a gold throne toilet. Their new lord angrily told his followers that they were martyrs to political correctness, which then mutated into wokeness. The great charlatan convinced his clan that white Christians were the victims, the real victims of discrimination in America. And since they were allegedly under attack, wasn't it time to fight back and reclaim America for all those uppity minorities and homosexuals and abortionists and women who just wanted, to get paid equally? These bitter white evangelicals are the real power, and it's scary, but they're the real power behind MAGA's ascent. They are the base, and they will unequivocally be calling the shots if the American experiment is ended by force or fiat. The new America won't be Trumpistan, but a Christian version of Afghanistan. And without democracy upholding the will of the majority, we will be under the tyrannical yoke of a fanatical religious minority. The draconian Texas GOP platform is terrifying. But it's going to go, if they take charge, from an aspirational right-wing document to a cruel legal code that will harshly punish heretics and heathens, which is probably what they think of you and me. And my guess is that LGBTQ pride would be outlawed and violently suppressed by police if they took over, because that's what's happening in traditional values dictatorships like Russia. And conversion therapy, pray away the gay therapy, it will be widely available to change gay people so they won't be involved in what the Texas Republican platform calls a, quote, an abnormal lifestyle choice. Transgender people, if they take over, will simply cease to exist in public spaces and will be unable to receive even the most basic medical care they need. New York Times opinion columnist Charles Blow, who identifies as bisexual, wisely identified the Republicans' goal of building a gay ghetto. He said, "Make no mistake, this is all part of a renewed, broad-based attack on gay rights and gay culture to stanch the rise of young people who are coming out. And if you think the right once established by the court can't be rescinded by the court, Look no further than in the expected ruling from the Court on Abortion. There is no finality in the battle for civil rights, Blow said. Wins don't stay won. They must be defended and can sometimes be reversed. Republicans may not be able to push people back into the closet, but they can try to reestablish some stigma to prevent them from coming out in the first place and build us, cultural gay ghettos if we do. Isn't that what we're seeing? Well, these attacks on pride by neo-Nazi groups and white supremacists? Isn't that what we are seeing when these white supremacists enter drag readings in libraries and attack the people involved in it? They're trying to push people in the closet. They're creating a stigma. That's why they call gay and lesbian people groomers. They want to terrify people and make it so if you come out, you'll be considered a child molester. Even though most of these molestations are taking place in, say, the Catholic Church or the Southern Baptist Convention. At heart, the Texas Republican Party is a seditious cell that has planted the seeds for secession or civil war. The state party passed a crazy resolution embracing the big lie that Donald Trump is the legitimate president and Joe Biden is only in the White House because he stole the election. Let's forget that Biden won by millions of votes. Washington Post columnist Greg Sargent accurately describes the Texas GOP platform as, quote, a veritable piñata bursting with far-right extremist fantasies. It states that Texas retains the right to secede from the United States and urges the Texas legislature to reaffirm this. It flatly declares that no validation of transgender identity is legitimate. It dismisses all gun regulations as a violation of God-given rights, and sharply rebukes Senator John Cornyn for pursuing a bipartisan gun safety package that's extraordinarily modest. You know, it's interesting with all this secession talk that every big city in Texas votes for Democrats. So you're essentially having a Pol Pot type of intervention of country bumpkins rushing into the big cities to take over and assert their dominance. Yeah, I guess that's going to work out really well for Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and especially Austin. The Republican Party is not fucking around. They are already planning for a successful post-coup America. They're assuming the coup will be successful, and they've unveiled a psychotic new manifesto by the Edmund Burke Foundation. And this dictatorial document is called National Conservatism, a Statement of Principles. If the insurrectionists get their way, this document may soon form the basis of our new Constitution. Washington Post columnist David Von Drell explicitly warns us, that this right-wing rule book by the Edmund Burke Foundation, quote, sounds a lot like fascism. It's exclusionary and discriminatory. It's an ideology identified as, quote, national conservatism, which sounds a bit too much like the Nazis' National Socialism for my liking. According to this maniacal manifesto, quote, where a Christian majority exists, public life should be rooted in Christianity and its moral vision, which should be honored by the state and other institutions, both public and private. In regions of a nation where the moral vision is corrupted by immorality, national government must intervene energetically to restore order. Achtung, nein! Listen to what they're saying. This is fascism. It really is. And this is supposed to be the party of limited government. Remember when Republicans believed in that? But now they believe national government must intervene energetically to restore order. So this is the future if the ongoing coup against democracy succeeds. They're putting it in plain English. They're telling us what they're going to do. Rural areas in America will be run by hardcore fundamentalist religious councils. In the cities, the federal government will intervene to crush resistance and install Christian morality police to, quote, restore order. If you think about it, it really smells like a Christian version of the Taliban or the totalitarian rule of Iran's Ayatollahs. Do you want to live in such a deranged, oppressive society? I sure as hell don't. Of course, we don't have to wait for the illegal capture of the White House for these zealots to enact their unpopular radical agenda. They have already purloined the Supreme Court by acting in remarkably bad faith, denying Democratic presidential administrations the rightful turn to appoint justices. Meanwhile, they have stacked the court with movement loyalists, including a fanatical cult member. Yeah, Amy Coney Barrett, who once served as a handmaid. Let's also not forget Clarence Thomas, whose treason wife, Ginny, was a lead cheerleader for the insurrection. Do you really think that Clarence Thomas believes in democracy? Do you trust him anymore? I don't. The result of the court putsch is the impending end of legal abortion, the unlimited supply and transport of weapons of war to terrorize opponents, dark money to fund political smear campaigns, unlimited gerrymandering to upend fair elections, and funneling public money to religious schools, as Pakistan did to extremist madrasas, which led to the Taliban. Although these radical rulings are being handed down from the judiciary, the illegitimacy of the Republican-installed justices, who are an audacious contravention of American majority opinion, have made these dictates, in a sense, extrajudicial. These justices are demanding that all Americans follow the rules of their personal right-wing churches, even though the vast majority of the people chose not to join these archaic institutions or follow their anachronistic rules. But hey, now we all have membership cards from Opus Dei, People of Praise, or Franklin Graham's Fundamentalist Church, whether we like it or not. Religious pluralism has apparently been replaced with religious nationalism, and the First Amendment has been discarded for a front row pew in the First Baptist Church. Hey, sounds like America, doesn't it? We must resolve ourselves to counter this onslaught while we still can raise our voices, because our voices will be stilled if these primitive fanatics complete their takeover of American society. There is no mystery what these retrograde elements plan to do, because they have already telegraphed their intentions. They've written it on paper. They've put it in a platform. They were already jamming their insane views and medieval mandates down our throats. If we don't fight like hell now to reclaim our country, our lives will be pure hell in short order. Wake up, America, because if we don't become energized, our democracy will be euthanized. The choice is ours, and I choose to fight, and I hope you do too. As part of Pride Month, we're doing an interview with James Kirchick, the author of a new book, Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. It's about Washington, D.C., and how it became one of the gay capitals of the United States. It wasn't always that way. In your new book, you talk about the Lavender Scare, a frightful era for the LGBT community. Tell us about that.
Everyone knows about the Red Scare, when communists and suspected communists were basically hounded out of government. But what most people don't know is that there was a sort of concurrent and in many ways related purge of LGBT people from the government called the Lavender Scare. And there were actually far more gay people who lost their jobs as a result of their sexual orientation than people who lost their jobs because they were either communists or suspected communists.
What led to this anti-LGBTQ hysteria that created the Lavender Scare? What was behind it?
It was a combination of the fear of communism, which is a legitimate fear. We were engaged in a global conflict with the Soviet Union, and also to sort of a traditional, moral opposition to homosexuality, and the belief that homosexuality was almost like a virus that could be spread in the same way that communism could be spread. And so these two phenomena were basically conflated in the minds of many people. And on top of that, you did have the Cambridge spy network, and 3 of the 5 men involved in the Cambridge spy network were either gay or bisexual. So that sort of added to this conception in the public imagination that homosexuality was a form of treason, not just a moral treason, but actual political treason against American society.
And even President Eisenhower had a role in the Lavender Scare. Tell us about it.
President Eisenhower signed an executive order that didn't mention homosexuality by name, but it allowed the government to basically kick out anyone found guilty of perversion. And so this was used as the means by which to, hunt out and interrogate and really basically ruin people's careers and lives based upon the suspicion that they might be gay.
One of the most fascinating figures in your book, and I used to know him, and you've had a relationship with him as well, Frank Amity. And he was someone who said, enough. I'm not going to sit back and take this homophobia. I'm going to fight back. Tell us about this remarkable individual and his impact on the movement.
Living here, I came to know a man named Frank Amity, who became famous because he was the first gay person who had been fired from his job because he was gay to actually challenge his firing. And most people at the time, in fact, all the people at that time, would just sort of go on with their lives the way that they could. They'd move to a different city. Frank was unique in that he basically said, this is wrong, I'm going to challenge this legally. And he had no support structure. There was no, gay rights organizations at the time that would support him. So he did this on his own. He didn't win his case. He tried to get it up to the Supreme Court. He was involved in the founding of the DC chapter of the Mattachine Society, which was the first real organized gay organization in the United States. And he basically lived the rest of his life as a sort of independent gay activist. He never got a job back in the government. And in fact, it wasn't until 2009, I believe, that the federal government actually apologized to him. And it was actually Barack Obama himself. So it was a real, amazing life to go from hounded out of the government, demonized. And you look at the letters, the correspondence between him and the various government officials that he was writing to, calling him a degenerate, a pervert, telling him that your kind will never be allowed to work in government, and then being the recipient of an honor from the President of the United States. It's quite a trajectory.
What do you think it was about him that made him different and said, I'm going to fight?
Frank was just a stubborn guy. Mm-hmm. And that can be annoying in some contexts to deal with stubborn people, but on this, he was stubborn and he was right. And he would say often, he said, I knew that the world was wrong on this issue, and I was going to make the world bend to me, and I wasn't going to bend to the world. And that takes a lot of courage. To be in America in the 1950s and to have everyone from the medical and psychiatric community to the government say that homosexuality is an illness and you're diseased, and say, no, you're wrong and I'm going to fix it. And I didn't mention earlier, Frank was also instrumental in getting the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its list of mental disorders in 1973. And that, I think, is actually, and that happened here in Washington at their convention.
And that was a huge victory at the time. I think people today forget how monumental it was to no longer be considered mentally ill.
I think that was actually one of the most important developments in the history of the gay rights movement, probably even more important than Stonewall, because that was the rationale that everyone in these establishment institutions could use to keep gays out, was to basically say you're mentally unfit to serve in the military, in the government, in work. We can discriminate against you because you have this psychological illness. And so to be able to get the medical community to change on that, I think was a real important move.
Given the historic importance of Frank Amity, it's amazing that a lot of people, even in the LGBT community, don't know who he is.
I actually think he's really one of the unacknowledged figures in American history. You could put him up there almost with sort of the Martin Luther King of the gay community. And he hasn't gotten that. There's a street named after him, 17th Street, a stretch of that. But, he's not taught in the schools in the same way that African American or women's rights activists are.
Your book talks about the incredible changes that have taken place for LGBTQ people in Washington, D.C. Talk about that for a moment.
U.S. civil service in 1975, up until that point, you could be fired for being gay. In 1975, they lifted that restriction. So D.C., in a way, was actually a trailblazer in terms of non-discrimination. D.C. was really one of the first in 1975 because the federal government made it so that gay people could work in the federal government. And so that was another reason why gay people would perhaps come to D.C., particularly if they were coming from the hinterlands, because if you're living in Oklahoma or Texas, you could be fired for being gay. But at that time, in 1975, there were very few places that would protect you for being gay, except the federal government, not security jobs. The Pentagon, security clearances, you could be stripped of one until 1994, I believe, not 1995 when Bill Clinton signed a law. But other branches of the federal civil service, you could work and be an openly gay person.
I don't think people equate it with one of the most gay towns, the gayest towns in the entire country, like San Francisco, West Hollywood, New York, but not Washington, however, per capita.
It is the highest. about 10%. I think there are several reasons for that. I think it has to go back to the World War II and this city turning from basically a sleepy southern swampy town into basically at that point the capital of the world because of the role that the U.S. then assumed as a global power in the wake of World War II. Washington was the capital. Washington was therefore the capital of the world. And you had these new institutions, massive federal bureaucracy being built in the aftermath of World War II. They needed people to service them and staff them. And so you had lots of gay people, particularly gay men coming from rural areas of the country looking for work, looking to perhaps to escape the kind of small town homophobia that they would have experienced, and they would come to Washington. I think, again, particularly for gay men who don't have families in the same extent that straight men obviously do, could throw themselves into a life of politics and working for politicians because they would have the time if you didn't have a family at home, and sort of they could be very loyal to their boss, whether it's a senator or a department head in the Housing and Urban Development Department. So I think that was another reason why you've had lots of gay people coming to Washington over the years. And then in more recent years, it's just become a very gay-friendly city.
When you hear about the LGBTQ rights movement, you hear a lot about New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Where does Washington, D.C. fit in historically with these other major metropolises?
I actually think it is the most important city in the history of the American gay rights movement. The medical diagnosis, the reversal of that in 1973 and 1975, eliminating discrimination against gay people in the federal service, in the federal civil service. And then if you just look at the role that gay people in this city oftentimes quietly played in advancing the cause of gay rights. So obviously in New York, you had very loud activists, ACT UP during the AIDS crisis, in the arts community. In San Francisco, similarly in the arts community. And they were, sort of free to be open. It was, I don't want to underplay the role that those people played. It was kind of easier in a place like New York or San Francisco. But this is a conservative town, Washington, and it's the capital of the nation. And it brings people from all over this country here to work together to solve the problems of our nation. And you had gay people in all different sorts of offices, in congressional offices and senatorial offices, working in the Pentagon, and they were quietly sort of proving to their straight peers that they were normal, human beings, and they were capable of serving their country just like straight people were. And I think that played a really underappreciated role in the gay rights movement.
We've been talking about the official advances with the LGBTQ movement, but there's also the underground bar scene that was big in Washington, D.C.
So one of the earliest gay bars in Washington, of course, these things couldn't be officially advertised as gay at the time, was called the Chicken Hut, and it was near the White House. And it was famous because there were telephones at each table. And if you saw someone you liked at a different table, you would ring, it was, these old sort of rotary phones, and you would dial the table number, and the person would pick up, and you could talk to them that way.
It must have been very embarrassing to get rejected at that bar, especially if somebody was a little bit too aggressive, like, enough already, you've called me 40 times. And that was before messaging machines, so you couldn't even put them off. Another aspect of Washington that might surprise people from back in the day is the cruising spots were in some of the most famous places in Washington. For example, one cruising spot was in front of the White House.
There were other places. The Iwo Jima Memorial was actually in May still. I'm not, I don't know personally, but there were lots of stings at the Iwo Jima Memorial. In fact, there was a congressman, last John Hinson from Mississippi, who was arrested there once at the Iwo Jima Memorial. Other cruising grounds, Peace Street Beach near Rock Creek Park.
Which is dangerous because people would get stabbed there or blackmailed.
Yes, and blackmail was a huge issue for gay people at the time. There's actually a fascinating story. One of the characters in the book, a guy named Joe Alsop, who was one of the most famous journalists of his era. He was a columnist, a syndicated columnist, a friend of John F. Kennedy, and he went to Moscow in 1957, and the Soviets basically set him up in a honey trap where they sent a young, handsome man to basically, pick him up at a public bathroom. He went back to his hotel with him, and the Soviets, the KGB took photos of this and tried to blackmail Joe Alsop. And what's interesting is they sent these photos around Washington to all his enemies, and he had many enemies. He was a very controversial guy, and no one took the bait. No one actually, tried to use this information to hurt Joe Alsop. It was a different era back then. Whereas today, the slightest bit of gossip on someone could easily be used and would easily be used because we're so partisan.
Yeah, that was definitely a time before Twitter and 30-second ads. No doubt about that.
We're less homophobic, obviously, now, but we're much more willing to use gossip and innuendo to hurt our political enemies. But in the 1960s and 1970s, there was sort of a code where if you were a prominent enough person, like Joe Alsop was, you could be protected.
Before we go, and I have to bring this up, one of my favorite things that you've done is you went on RT Russia Today at a time when a lot of Americans were going on there and saying nothing about Russia's anti-gay laws. And you went on with rainbow suspenders and took on the Kremlin.
Being here on a Kremlin-funded propaganda network, I'm going to wear my gay pride suspenders and I'm going to speak out and to let the Russian gay people know that they have friends and allies and solidarity from people all over the world, and that we're not going to be silent in the face of this horrific repression that is perpetrated by your paymasters, by Vladimir Putin. Seeing what happens to journalists in Russia who are routinely harassed, tortured, in some cases killed by the Russian government.
James, you
how
have to
you
come
can call
over
yourself a
here
journalist and how you can go to sleep at night.
James Kirchick, the author of Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. Terrific book. You should check it out. Thank you, James, for appearing on The War of the Words with Wayne Besen. Have you watched the January 6th committee hearings? If not, you should. They've been revelatory and must-see television. They have surpassed my expectations, and they have shined a searing spotlight on the profound perfidy and perniciousness of one of America's two political parties. Guess which one that is. And although a gripping drama, it's been somewhat difficult because we have to relive the trauma. Our ongoing troubles are caused almost exclusively by a radicalized segment of society, egged on by shameless politicians that have wrought instability on our once secure country. I mean, it sickens me when I think about it. It saddens me when I contemplate what they have done to us. It's also been really challenging to watch the innocent people harmed by Trump's crusade, including patriotic poll workers such as Ruby Freeman and her daughter Shay Moss. They've had their lives upended. They've been threatened because they were singled out by Donald Trump's malice machine. While there are several additional hearings on the horizon, a few conclusions are already abundantly clear. First, Donald Trump is essentially a mafia don who ran a criminal enterprise directly out of the Oval Office. That's indisputable at this point. And the scope of his criminality and abuse of power to illegally remain president is breathtaking. Given the audacity of Trump's ongoing conspiracy to defraud the country, the United States will not be able to move forward, nor will democracy be safe until Trump is in prison. Representative Adam Schiff was correct when he said during the hearing, quote, "If the most powerful person in the world can bring the full weight of the presidency down on an ordinary citizen who is merely doing her job with a lie as big and heavy as a mountain, who among us is safe?" It's worth repeating, who among us is safe? With an authoritarian like Donald Trump, no one is. I understand there's hesitation in some quarters, like the Justice Department at this point, to slap handcuffs on Donald Trump for fear of how his rabid cult followers might react to his arrest. Oh, we might get them angry. We can't upset these people. Yeah, actually we can. And they can't get any angrier. I mean, they've already stormed the Capitol. How much more pissed off can they get than that? The real danger is allowing the threat to further metastasize by letting this shameless crook posing as a president walk free after brazenly staging a coup. Until the rule of law is restored, we will cease to be a nation of rules, our laws, as Republicans will keep pushing and pushing and pushing our institutions and norms past the breaking point. If the reaction to Trump's incarceration means battling MAGA thugs in the streets, so be it. I don't want that to happen, but I'm prepared for it. or countries worth fighting for. It's better to have that confrontation now if it must be had than after Trump or a fascist successor like, say, Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis falsely declares voter fraud in the future to illegally steal an election and consolidates power. The second lesson from the January 6th hearings: the Justice Department needs to arrest and indict every seditious sycophant such as lawyers John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani. Every hate group leader that spreads terror across the country, including on January 6th, also needs to be wearing an orange jumpsuit. We should stop tolerating threats on the internet. You threaten somebody on the internet, the cops need to be at the door of this person and slapping handcuffs on them. We've let this go too far. These measures I'm suggesting are as much preventative as they are punitive. The Republican sabotage of democracy hasn't ended. It's ongoing. It's a rolling coup. In most states, peddlers of the big lie are winning Republican primaries. The GOP is recruiting loyalists to serve as election workers with instructions to find fraud as a pretext to disrupt or dispute election results in 2024. By arresting today the perpetrators and peddlers of the big lie, the Justice Department can send a powerful message to these aspiring criminals. If they do the crime, they will do the time. And nope, they won't be getting a Trump pardon. The third lesson from the hearings: a combination of epic spinelessness and unchecked ambition led weak Republican leaders, such as Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and House Republican Conference Leader Elise Stefanik, to cower under the weight of Trump's threats. They twisted themselves in psychological pretzels to stay in Trump's good graces, and in doing so, they put their careers ahead of their country. This craven party can't be trusted with power, nor can it represent America's best interest with honesty, decency, or integrity. The party's dead as far as having any value in America today. The fourth lesson we learned from the hearings: the Trump White House thrived on bullying and intimidation. It eagerly normalized and embraced the threat of mob violence as a political tactic. It strategically used messaging, whether online, in the media, in speeches, to encourage vigilante goons to harass opponents and use fear to silence those who would not endorse the big lie. Who can forget when Trump gave his signal to the Proud Boys during a presidential debate to stand back and stand by? That's precisely what they did until Trump unleashed them on our Capitol building on January 6th to stop the certification of Joe Biden's victory. From the moment Trump slithered down his tacky gold escalator at Trump Tower in 2015 to announce he would run for president, these undesirable elements have felt emboldened. They found a friend in Donald Trump. They now serve as his shock troops and the MAGA movement's enforcers. As I said before, it's like the mob. Violence has become such an everyday occurrence in post-Trump politics that it's hardly even news this week that members of the January 6th committee are under imminent threat of attack and had to receive increased security detail. Hardly made the news. Over the weekend, Representative Adam Kinzinger, who's on the January 6th committee, publicly released a deranged letter addressed to his wife that threatened to murder them and their 5-month-old baby. How very nice of these Republicans. Kinzinger said on ABC's This Week, "There is violence in the future, I'm going to tell you. And until we get a grip on telling people the truth, we can't expect any differently." I agree with them. We're going to see acts of terror because they're acting like terrorists. The Republican penchant for violent words and imagery has increasingly appeared in political advertising too, where extremists who are running for office are airing these incredibly unhinged ads where they bandy assault rifles. You would think that half these people running for office were recruiting for the military. They all have guns now. They're no longer content, though, to terrorize liberals. These yahoos have moved on to staging mock hunts of Republicans who dismiss Trump's big lie. For example, Missouri GOP Senate candidate Eric Rittens posted a television ad on Monday where he dressed in a military-style uniform while hunting down moderate Republicans with a war weapon. His ad said, "Hi, I'm Eric Rittens, Navy SEAL, and today we're going rhino hunting." He said this while loading a gun. Rhino, of course, is a slur for the sane Republicans, the few that are left that stand for reality. And Rhino means Republican in name only. As an aside, it's worth pointing out that Grittens is not a good guy with a gun, as he likes to portray himself. He resigned as Missouri's governor in 2018 after allegations that he had an extramarital affair. Another good Republican family values guy. His alleged mistress claimed that he was, quote, physically abusive and threatened her. According to CBS News, Gretton's resignation was part of a deal with a St. Louis prosecutor to drop a felony charge alleging misuse of a charity donors list to raise funds for his 2016 gubernatorial campaign. Gretton's also stands accused by his ex-wife of abusing her and their young son. So this guy's like abusive, he's cheating. He allegedly has a slush fund, this charity donor fund he shouldn't be raising money off of. Typical Republican these days. It's sad but true. Apparently, this crazy guy's resume and seeming penchant for violence is no longer radioactive or a disqualifier in Republican circles. In fact, he's a poster boy for the modern Republican Party. They love him now. This is what the GOP has been reduced to. Alleged wife beaters, mistress slappers, and child abusers peddling conspiracies, lies, and commercials saturated with threats of gun violence. If you need more evidence that the Republican Party is bloodthirsty, consider that Texas Senator John Cornyn was booed at the Texas GOP convention this weekend for working on a weak bipartisan gun deal. That was too extreme for these Republicans, just red flag laws, too much for them. They want crazy people to have guns. It's not about good guys with guns. They want bad people to have easy access to. Let's get real. The violence, unfortunately, is seeping beyond partisan politics, with groups being targeted by Trump-inspired white supremacists and Nazis. These white supremacists and Nazis feel like they have carte blanche to do whatever the hell they want now. A new study by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project found that, quote, 9 times as many anti-LGBT demonstrations were reported in 2021 relative to 2020. At least 15% of these demonstrations turned violent or destructive. And they predicted that 2022 is on track to be worse than 2021. So it's only getting worse. The violence is increasing. Terror and treason are business as usual for the modern GOP. At this stinking, sinking point of its moral and ethical demise, the Republican Party is incapable of reforming on its own. It needs an intervention. I'd like to tell you that voting will be enough to save the country, but voting may no longer be enough. It likely requires filling police paddy wagons with Republican politicians, including and especially Donald Trump, who committed crimes and put their own selfish interests above America's. If we do not directly address the source of our problems, we will never find solutions. Donald Trump must be taken away and indicted. He must be put on trial and eventually put in prison for his crimes against the United States of America. We're going to end today's podcast with a little levity. Well, it's actually a tragedy, what passes for levity today. According to LGBTQ Nation, Republican Arizona gubernatorial candidate Kari Lake insinuated that drag queens and queer people are a threat to children. And she put a bill forth to make sure that young people couldn't be taking the drag shows. But a local drag queen reminded the right-wing politician that she once brought her own kid to a drag performance, that she had drag queen friends and loved drag shows herself. This right-wing politician mounted the defense. She said, well, she doesn't like drag shows. She likes female impersonators. She actually said that. You know, Republicans got decades of laughter out of Bill Clinton saying, "I did not inhale," or the meaning of is. And apparently they've learned well, because now a drag show is bad, but female impersonators are good. What ties Republicanism together today, because there's many different stripes of it, is the ability to lie, to prevaricate, to fudge the truth. And what Kari Lake is doing is just representative of today's Republican Party. And quite frankly, It's a drag. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Thank you for listening to War of the Words with Wayne Besen. We're available on all major podcast platforms. Let your friends know about us. Until we meet again, see you next time.